There are those who are given a purpose from birth, named, dressed in it, sent into the world with its weight already settled on their shoulders. And there are those who must find their purpose the hard way, by losing everything they thought it was. The rain had not stopped in 3 days. It fell in gray curtains over the mountain pass of Aldenmore, turning the stone road into a river of pale mud and erasing the distinction between sky and cliff. A lone figure moved through it, without shelter and without haste. A young man of perhaps 22, lean beneath a travel-worn cloak the color of old iron. His boots were caked to the ankle. His hand rested, out of habit more than need, on the pommel of the sword at his hip, a blade with no noble crest on its hilt, no jewel on its pommel, no name engraved along its length, just a sword, just a man. His name was Caelen Ashford, and 3 weeks ago, someone had murdered his master. He had not cried. He had not raged. Not yet. He had done what his master had always taught him to do when the mind was flooded with feeling. He had walked. He had walked from the ruins of the Thornhaven Academy, past the burned archive hall where Master Oryn had spent 30 years studying the theory of the blade, past the courtyard where Caelen had first held a sword as a child of 7 and nearly cut off his own thumb. He had walked through 3 kingdoms worth of road without stopping for more than sleep, and still the grief sat in his chest like a stone that had not yet decided whether to sink or rise. Master Oryn Vael, the Saint of Blades, a man of 61 years, quiet eyes, hands more calloused than any blacksmith's, and a habit of humming tunelessly when he was thinking. He had accepted Caelen as an apprentice when no other master would. Not because the boy showed promise, though he did, but because Oryn had told him years later he had seen something in the child's eyes that reminded him of himself. A refusal to accept that the world had already decided what he was worth. No noble blood, no family name of consequence, no patron. Just a boy from the lower quarters of Eden March who had walked 40 miles to ask a legend for a lesson and had refused to leave until he was given one. Oryn had laughed, the only time Caelen had ever heard him laugh, and let him in. 15 years. 15 years of dawn drills and evening theory, of bleeding knuckles and bruised ribs, of forms practiced until they were no longer forms, but extensions of thought. And alongside him for 11 of those years, Davin Crest, the son of a lesser lord, sent to the academy at 14 with all the arrogance his bloodline could carry. They had hated each other for exactly 4 months and 2 days. Then Davin had taken a knife meant for Caelen during a training accident, and after that, words like hate had ceased to apply. Brother. The word had been used only once, late at night, after a particularly brutal sparring session, when both of them were too exhausted to maintain the fiction of dignity. Davin had said it first. Caelen had not repeated it. He rarely spoke what mattered most, but he had not needed to. Now Davin Crest was the crown's sword, the highest-ranked knight in the kingdom of Orenthus,
a 7-star swordsman whose name was spoken in courts and taverns alike, and 3 weeks ago, witnesses at the Thornhaven Academy had seen him walk through the gate at dawn, exchange no words with the master who came to greet him, and drive a blade through Oryn Vael's chest with the efficiency of someone completing a task they had long since made peace with. Caelen had not been there.
He had been a day's ride south, following a rumor about a rogue enchanter who had been attacking merchant caravans. He had returned to find the courtyard empty and the archive hall smelling of accelerant. He stood now at the crest of the Aldenmore Pass, rain driving cold needles against his face, and looked down into the valley, where the capital of Varanthesis lay spread like a map of everything he had never been allowed to want. Towers of pale stone, the great market district with its permanent haze of cook-fire smoke, and at the city's heart, the royal citadel, where Davin would be. He did not know yet why. He would find out. He started down the mountain. The city of Varanthesis had a smell Caelen associated with childhood awe. Bread, horse, iron, and the faint mineral tang of the river that split the lower districts from the noble quarter.
He had visited twice as a boy, once as Oryn's apprentice to observe the blade trials, and the city had seemed enormous then, loud and indifferent and magnificent. It seemed smaller now, or perhaps he was simply no longer a child looking up at it. He spent the first day doing nothing that would draw attention. He rented a room in the Potter's Quarter under a false name, something he had learned from a retired intelligence officer Oryn had once invited to lecture at the academy, paid in advance, and slept for 14 hours. The grief was still there when he woke. It had not gone anywhere. He folded it up like a letter he would read again later, and got to work. The academy had kept meticulous records. Master Oryn had believed that everything worth knowing about the art of the blade had been written down somewhere, and that the job of a swordsman was to read as much as fight. He had instilled this in all his students. It meant Caelen knew where to look.
There was a public archive in the Merchants' District, not for state secrets, but for guild filings, court records, land disputes, and the minutes of open council sessions. Caelen spent 2 days reading. What he found was not a smoking sword, but something more insidious, a pattern.
Then, 6 months ago, there had been a closed session of the council. No minutes were public. But 2 weeks after that session, a royal writ had been issued, authorizing the Crown Sword to address matters of irregular military presence within the kingdom's borders at his discretion. Caelen read that sentence 4 times. He was not a lawyer, but he understood what it meant. The nobles had not simply asked for something to be done. They had maneuvered the king into giving Davin the authority to do it. Cleanly, legally, deniably. And Davin, the finest knight in the kingdom, the man who had once bled for Caelen without hesitation, had accepted. He sat back from the archive table and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Oryn had not been the first. A woman named Sarah Blackthorn, an 8-star, the finest spear fighter of her generation,
had died in what was officially recorded as a traveling accident 5 months ago.
Old Gareth of the South Roads, a 7-star retired from active service, had been found dead in his home 3 months past. Caelen had known both of them. They had visited Thornhaven. They had eaten at Oryn's table. And here was the moment he would not forgive himself for, long after the courtyard had dried and the city had moved on. He had felt it. 3 weeks before Oryn's death, he had felt something was wrong. Not in his mind, in his body. The way a blade vibrates faintly when it has been struck at a bad angle. A wrongness. He had noticed it during his last evening at the academy. A look Oryn gave him when he thought Caelen wasn't watching. A look that was not sadness, but was not entirely not sadness either. He had not asked. He had told himself it was nothing. He had ridden south the next morning to chase a rumor about a rogue enchanter. If he had asked. He had understood then what he understood now, about how networks of power moved against those they feared. If he had possessed one more piece of knowledge, if Oryn had trusted him enough to share what he suspected, or if Caelen had been wise enough to demand to know, the archive hall would not have burned. Oryn would not be ash. He understood it fully now, and the understanding did not make him feel powerful. It made him feel tired in a way that sleep would not fix. The nobles feared them, not because swordsmen had threatened them. None of the highest-ranked blades in Varanthus had ever raised arms against the crown, but because they could. Because a 5-star swordsman answered to no lord, pledged allegiance to no house, and could not be controlled by threats that worked on ordinary soldiers.
They were loose pieces on a board that noble families had spent generations arranging, and the simplest solution to those with enough power and not enough wisdom was to remove the pieces. He thought of Daven, who had grown up believing in order and hierarchy and the proper functioning of the kingdom's structures. Daven, who had always been the one to say that a knight's duty was not to himself, but to the realm. Daven, who had trained under Oryn for 11 years, and then, when presented with a royal mandate and a coalition of noble houses pressing from every direction, had apparently decided that duty meant something different than it once had. Caelen did not know if he hated him. He wasn't sure hate was the right word for what he felt when he thought of Daven's face. He knew only that he was going to find out directly what remained of the man he had once called brother.
That night, he visited the estate of Duke Aldrich Greaves, the wealthiest signatory to the petition, the man the gossip networks of the Potter's Quarter consistently named as the coalition's architect. He went over the garden wall. He went alone. He was back in his rented room before the second bell of the night watch, with dried blood on his sleeve and the Duke's signet ring in his pocket. He had not wanted to kill the Duke. He had wanted information. The Duke had provided it, all of it, eventually, and then had made the mistake of reaching for a panic cord behind his desk. Caelen slept without dreams.
The royal citadel's great hall could seat 400 people when the full court assembled.
On the morning Caelen walked through its main gate, not over a wall, not through a servant's entrance, but through the front gate, with the Duke's signet ring on a cord around his neck, and Oryn's academy seal pinned to his cloak. Roughly 200 were present, enough for the word to spread before evening. He carried the Duke's head in a sack. This was not something he had planned to do. He had planned to deliver the Duke's signed confession, which was folded in his inner pocket. But the Duke had died resisting, and Caelen had learned in 15 years of studying the blade that intention and outcome were not always the same thing, and that a good swordsman adjusted. He placed the sack on the floor in front of the throne dais. The court went silent, with the particular silence of people who cannot believe what their eyes are reporting.
He looked up at the king, a man of 50, gray at the temples, intelligent-looking in the way that men who have spent their lives being managed by smarter advisors sometimes appeared. And then he looked at the faces arranged around the throne. He recognized 4 of them from Greaves' descriptions. The architects, the ones who had signed the petition and pressed until a royal writ made murder legal. He did not address them, not yet. "Davin Crest," he said to the room at large, his voice carrying the particular clarity that years of academy training in projection had given him. "I am here to speak with Davin Crest. Tell him Caelen Ashford is waiting." The silence stretched. Then, from the far end of the hall, a door opened. Davin had always been large, not in the brutish way of men who relied on mass, but in the way of someone whose body had been refined by the same years of training that had refined Caelen's, arriving at a different result.
He was 31 now, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing court armor that had clearly been put on in a hurry. His face, when he came close enough for Caelen to read it, was composed. That had always been the difference between them. Davin composed, Caelen still. 2 ways of being the same thing. He stopped 12 feet away. He looked at the sack. He looked at Caelen. "I wondered when," he said quietly. "I needed to understand first," Caelen said. "I know now. I know everything." He reached into his cloak and placed the Duke's signed confession on the floor beside the sack. "The council can read that after, or not. It doesn't change what happens next." Davin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Caelen, this was never—" "I'm not here to argue with you," Caelen said. "I know what you think you were doing. I know what they told you it meant. I know about the writ." A pause. "I know about Sarah Blackthorne and Gareth." Something shifted in Davin's expression. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of weight acknowledging itself. He said nothing. "Master Olin taught us both," Caelen said. "He gave us everything we have. Whatever the law said, whatever those men told you about duty and realm and necessity." He stopped. He was not good at speeches, and he knew it. He tried again. "I'm here for the same reason you're still here, because we were trained to finish what we start, and this is unfinished." Davin was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the court had stopped breathing. Then he said, "The courtyard, away from the hall." Caelen nodded. "Just you, just me, just us,
Davin agreed, and for one terrible second, he sounded exactly the way he had sounded 11 years ago, after the knife, after the word, brother, and Caelen had to look away. They went to the Citadel's inner training yard, where the great flagstones had been worn smooth by generations of knights' boots.
The court followed at a distance, nobles and guards clustering at the yard's edges, like spectators at a trial they had not been summoned to attend. No one tried to stop them. Whatever authority governed this moment, it was not the kind that guards could interrupt. They drew their blades in unison. It was not a choreographed thing. It simply happened. Two men whose bodies had learned the same rhythms from the same teacher, expressing the same instinct at the same moment. Caelen heard someone near the wall inhale sharply, and then the world contracted to the width of a sword's edge. Davin moved first, a diagonal cut from the high right that opened into a low sweep, a combination Caelen had seen him use 1,000 times in practice. He deflected, redirected, stepped inside the arc and forced Davin to reset. They separated. Davin's eyes were calm. Caelen's were the same. They were, as they had always been, almost exactly matched.
The fight that followed was not the kind that stories usually described. No balletic leaping, no flashing lights, no speeches between strikes. It was precise and brutal and very, very fast. Two 7-star swordsmen moving through the forms they had both been taught until the forms dissolved, and what remained was pure intention, meeting pure intention. The flagstones ringing, sparks where steel found steel, the particular sound of breath being managed under exertion. Caelen took a cut across the left forearm in the fourth exchange. He used the pain to focus. He gave Davin a bruised rib in return, felt the impact travel up his blade, adjusted. They were even. They remained even. And then something happened that Caelen had no name for. It began as a pressure, not physical, but interior, a kind of mounting weight behind his sternum that he first mistook for emotion. Then it sharpened.
With every clash of steel, every moment of contact between his blade and Davin's, something was accumulating in him, the way a storm accumulates before the lightning finds its form. He felt himself reading Davin, not just with his eyes, but with something older, something that lived below thought. The angle of a shoulder, a half-second before the cut, the distribution of weight that preceded a pivot. Not prediction, something more immediate than prediction. Presence. A path opened in his mind. That was the only way he could describe it afterward. A door in a wall he had never known existed, swinging open onto a corridor that went further than he could see. This was the knowledge Oryn had spent 30 years accumulating. Not just the forms, not just the theory, but the distilled understanding of a master who had seen beyond technique into something older and truer. That the blade was never the answer. The wielder's awareness was.
Caelen had been given it, fragment by fragment, across 15 years. And now, in this moment of grief and fire and consequence, the fragments assembled themselves into a whole. He stepped through the door without deciding to. His sword moved differently, not faster, or rather, not only faster. It moved as though it understood the fight rather than participated in it. Davin's next combination,
A complex sequence Caelen had seen countered by no one met a response that shouldn't have existed, a deflection that turned the energy of the strike back along its own line and left Davin's guard open in a way that could not be recovered. Davin felt it. Caelen could see it in his eyes, the recognition that something had changed. Not panic. Davin Crest did not panic, but a soldier's recalibration. The acknowledgement that the ground had shifted. He pressed the advantage.
He pressed it with a grief that had finally found its shape, and with a love for a man he was killing that was no less real for being exactly that, and with the memory of Oryn Vael's hands on his shoulders 15 years ago, saying, "You will be something the world has not seen yet, Caelen. I cannot tell you what, but I can see the outline of it." The outline, he thought. Yes, this is the outline. It ended in 7 more seconds. 7 seconds of movement so concentrated that several of the watching courtiers would later claim they had looked away, not from horror, but from a peculiar instinct, the way one sometimes cannot look directly at something too bright. The flagstone sang. The air between the two men seemed to compress and release like a held breath.
Caelen's blade moved once, at an angle that had no name in any manual he had ever studied. A diagonal arc that crossed through Davin's remaining guard with a geometry that should have been impossible to generate from the body's natural pivot points. He understood only after the fact that he had moved through the opening in his mind and out the other side, and that the sword had followed. Davin Crest, the crown sword, the finest knight in the kingdom of Farinthis, 7-star swordsman, and the man who had once taken a knife for Caelen without being asked, fell to his knees in the courtyard his master had never visited. He did not fall as men fall in tavern brawls or battlefield chaos. He knelt, deliberately, Caelen would always believe, the way a knight kneels before a figure he recognizes as something greater than the institutions that shaped him. He looked up. His expression held no anger, no plea.
He said, in a voice only Caelen could hear, "You always were further along than you knew." Caelen looked at him for a moment that seemed to occupy more time than it should have. He thought of all the things that could be said in such a moment. He thought of the academy courtyard and the evening they had once stayed up until the 3rd bell arguing about the difference between loyalty and obedience, while Oryn sat in the doorway pretending not to listen. He thought of a knife taken without hesitation. He thought of a grave that had been burned so thoroughly there was nothing to bury. He raised his sword. He made it clean. He made it as quick as he knew how to make a thing like this, which was the only mercy he had left to give. For a moment, the courtyard held only the sound of rain that had finally decided to stop. Then Caelen straightened. He turned.
The gathered court of Varinthis looked back at him. Nobles, ministers, knights, functionaries, a collection of faces arranged along the spectrum between shock and something that had not yet decided what it was. He could see the 4 architects of the coalition clearly from where he stood. He could see the king, who had not moved from the doorway where he had apparently followed the crowd, standing very still,
with an expression Caelen could not fully parse. A man confronting, perhaps, the distance between the decisions he had authorized and the thing those decisions had produced. Caelen pointed his sword at the assembled court. He was aware that this was not a small gesture. He was a man with blood on his blade, and a body that had just moved in ways that even he did not yet fully understand. And the court of Varanthus was not composed of fools. They could feel that something had changed in the nature of what stood before them. He did not shout.
He had never needed to shout to be heard. "I am Caelen Ashford," he said. "I was apprenticed to Oryn Vael, whom you killed. I am not noble-born. I carry no house name, no crest, no title that any of you issued or could revoke." He let that settle. "What I carry is this." He raised the blade. "And what I have just done, what you all saw me do, is something that has not been done in this kingdom in living memory. You know what it means. Your scholars know. Your old soldiers know. Ask them tonight if you need the words for it." He paused. "You moved against the swordsmen of this kingdom because you feared what they could not be compelled to do. You were right to fear it. You were wrong to believe that killing them would solve it." His gaze moved across the faces of the 4 architects, one by one, and did not hurry.
"I am declaring to this court, and to the houses represented here, and to the king who gave the writ that made this possible. The swordsmen of Varanthus were not your subjects to execute. They were your protectors, whether you deserved that protection or not. And what you did to them, to Oryn Vael, to Sarah Blackthorn, to Gareth of the South Roads, and to the others whose names I will learn, I am going to hold you to account for. Not today. Today I am walking out of this courtyard." He lowered his sword to his side but did not sheath it. "But I will not be walking far." He retrieved Oryn's seal from his cloak and pressed it into the flagstone with his boot, not destroying it, simply leaving it there, planted in the center of the yard like a marker, like a declaration of territory. He walked toward the gate. The crowd parted. No one tried to stop him. At the gate, he paused without turning. He thought of what had opened in him during the fight.
The corridor that went further than he could see. He had been trained to understand the ranking system, the star designations that the swordsman guilds had developed over centuries to measure and communicate degrees of mastery. 7 stars was where the great practitioners lived. Men like Davin, like Sarah Blackthorn in her prime, like Oryn in the years before his body had begun to cost him. 8 was rare, 9 was historical, 10 was something people put in stories to explain why certain figures from ancient wars had been considered more than human by those who fought beside them. He had crossed a threshold today. He had felt it happen. He did not know yet what it meant in practical terms, what he could do now that he could not do before, what it would cost him, what learning to inhabit this new capacity would require. He knew only that the corridor was there, and that it went somewhere he had not yet been, and that Oryn had seen the outline of it long before he had.
He stepped through the gate into the street beyond. Varanthus spread around him in the pale, rain-washed afternoon light. The capital city of a kingdom that had just watched its finest night fall, that had just heard a common-born man with no title and no house name declared that it owed a debt it had not finished paying. The street vendors were still selling. The canal boats were still moving. The city was doing what cities do, continuing regardless of the pivot points of history that occasionally occurred within them. Caelen sheathed his sword. He began to walk. He had no destination yet, not today. There were things to learn first. He needed to find the names of the other swordsmen who had been lost in the months before Oryn. He needed to understand the full shape of the conspiracy, not just the parts Greaves had given up.
He needed, perhaps most urgently, to find those who were still alive. The swordsmen of 4 through 9 stars who had gone to ground when the pattern became clear, who were now scattered across Varenthus and the neighboring territories, waiting to learn if there was still something worth waiting for. And he needed, somewhere quieter than this, to begin the work of understanding what he had become. Behind him, in the royal citadel, a court was reckoning with a morning it had not expected. In the days and weeks that followed, scrolls would be sent to noble houses. Debates would be convened and suspended and convened again. The king, who was not without intelligence, would spend a long time looking at a confession signed in a dead duke's hand, and at the seal pressed into the courtyard flagstone, and would arrive at conclusions that his advisors would struggle to help him act on.
And in the lower quarters of a dozen cities, in the mountain holds and the rural estates and the coastal towns, where men and women who had dedicated their lives to the blade had quietly disappeared from public record, something was beginning to move. Word traveled along the old networks, the ones the guild had maintained since before the noble families had been as powerful as they now believed themselves to be. Word that Oryn Vael's apprentice had walked into the capital and walked out again. Word that the crown sword had fallen. Word that someone who carried no house name and no crest had done something in the citadel courtyard that the old masters described only in theoretical terms. The word was 10 stars. The last time those words had meant something specific rather than legendary, the history books suggested the maps of the known world had looked rather different.
Caelen Ashford walked through the streets of Varenthus with a stone still in his chest, smaller now, perhaps, but present, and the awareness of a war he had declared without being entirely certain he was ready to fight. He had Oryn's methods: study first, act with precision. He had what remained of his training, plus whatever had opened in the courtyard and not yet closed. He had the confession in his pocket and the dead duke's signet ring, which connected to threads he had not finished pulling. He had, as he had always had, nothing he had not earned. It had been enough before. Above the city, the clouds were beginning to separate, and through the gap, pale gold light touched the upper towers of the citadel and the rooftops of the merchant district and the old stone arch of the swordsman's gate. The gate that had stood for 300 years at the entrance to the guild quarter, the one the nobles had ordered sealed 2 months ago. Caelen looked at it as he passed.
He filed away the thought of it,
The sealed gate, the shuttered quarter, the absence where something alive had been, and kept walking. There was work to do. There were names to find, alliances to rebuild, and a kingdom's debts to collect. And the road, at last, was his to choose. Every story I tell on this channel exists for a reason. Caelen isn't that different from you or me. Someone who had to lose everything before he understood what he actually knew and what it cost him not to know it sooner. That moment when he realizes he felt something was wrong 3 weeks before Oryn died and chose not to ask. That's not a fantasy detail. That's one of the most human moments I know how to write. The price of the question we didn't ask. The door we walked past. I've spent a long time building this channel around stories like this one. Worlds with internal logic, characters whose choices have real weight, lore that rewards the kind of reader who actually pays attention.
That work takes more than good imagination. It takes frameworks, structural thinking, an understanding of how to build something that feels alive from the inside out, rather than assembled from the outside in. That's why I put together the Threshold of 10 Stars, the Unbranded Blade, not as a course on how to write fantasy, but as the actual system I use when I sit down to construct a world. The world-building architecture, the character logic, the way I think about power systems so they create drama rather than solve it. The reason Caelen's 10-star threshold lands the way it does is because I knew what it meant 4 months before I wrote this scene. If you've ever wanted to build something like this, a world with that same sense of depth beneath the surface, where every detail earns its place, the link is in the description. No pressure, no urgency, just the next step for those who are ready for it. I'll see you in the next story.